Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second community forum for the Bridge Street Neck Neighborhood Zoning Overlay District. We'll be getting started shortly. We just want to make sure that as many people join the meeting in advance of us getting started as possible, but we certainly want to respect everyone's time today. I do want to just let you know that we are recording and also Salem Access Television is here with us today to live stream the meeting. So just keep that in mind as you're participating today. And then in addition, if you have any questions during the meeting, please feel free to ask those in the chat. We will be, depending on how many people show up today, we will be doing either a large group conversation or breakout rooms. And your questions in the chat will help to guide that conversation. So between now or at any point during the presentation today, please feel free to send those questions in the chat. To get to the chat, it should be located in the bottom middle of your screen if you are on your computer or on a tablet. Sorry about that. If you're on your iPhone, if you're on a tablet, it's in the top left, right of your screen. You'd think I would know this by now after how many times I've said that, but all you need to do is click on the button that says chat and it should open up a text box that you'll be able to use to communicate with us. So I think we'll wait a little bit more and then I will turn it over to my colleague or to Amanda Giancola from the City of Salem to get us started. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Amanda because I think we are ready to get started. Thanks, everybody.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Bridge Street Neck Zoning Overlay Forum. We're excited to talk about this proposal with you. I just want to give you an idea of the format. So we're going to give some presentation material and then we're going to go into discussion with you. And then we're going to go into do a presentation again and then go into discussion. So it'll be a bit of a back and forth. We want you to be engaged throughout the process. And if you're comfortable with it, we'd love for you to turn your cameras on. Understand if you're not comfortable with that. And again, you can ask questions right in the comment. So I'm going to have Councillor Madore kick off the meeting and then we'll get right into it.
Thanks, Amanda, and thanks, Christian, for starting us off. I'm so happy that we have so many people joining us tonight, and I see that there's a few more that are filing in, especially on a Thursday night that's very hot. I'm so glad to see neighbors join us despite not seeing you in person. So we have been working on the zoning overlay district for Bridge Street Neck for more than a decade. And this is another milestone that we are glad to reach because we haven't really gotten this far with a full zoning proposal, let alone a robust community engagement process like this one. We did go over, we did conduct another period of community engagement with the Bridge Street Neck zoning, Bridge Street Neck visioning plan, and Chris will go over that a little bit in more detail. But I really do encourage neighbors, and if you're a business owner as well, to tell us what you're thinking. And we know, we recognize that zoning is a very complicated and sometimes very hard to understand topic. So please don't hesitate to ask any questions. There are no stupid questions. And even after this forum, we invite you to schedule office hours with staff at MAPC or Amanda to ask any more questions. there's a survey on the website that you can continue to contribute. And if the zoning proposal does get filed later this year for the city council, that's another opportunity to join and provide your thoughts as well. So again, thanks everyone for joining us tonight. You're in for a very informative session. And thank you again, staff from MAPC and our city planners for putting this forum together. Chris?
Thanks. Thank you, Councilor Madore. Christian, you can hit the next slide. Thanks. So my name is Chris Kushel. I'm with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. So for those who are not familiar with us, we're the regional planning agency that serves the Metro Boston area. That's 101 cities and towns. We wear a number of different hats, offer a number of different types of services to our communities. In this situation, we're basically acting as a consultant for the city to help with crafting this zoning. So as Amanda said, we're going to be kind of taking this in chunks because zoning is it's a dense topic. There's a lot to it. So we're going to kind of take some breaks and we'll get your comments on the things that I just discussed. So if we can go to the next slide. First, I think, Christian, we have a couple kind of Zoom polls, and we'll have a few of these throughout the presentation. So please feel free to fill these out. Go ahead, Christian.
Great. So I'm going to launch the poll. You should see it show up on your screen. In the event that you don't, it might actually be behind your Zoom window. So just minimize that just in case. But we invite you to respond to these questions. They just help us understand who we are reaching so that we can adjust engagement accordingly. Starting to see some answers roll in. So thank you so much, everybody. All right, I'm going to give us about 10 more seconds. So if you're still working on it. Awesome. So I'm going to end the poll and I'm going to share the results. So I see that most people, we actually had a pretty good spread on how familiar with you are zoning. How familiar are you with zoning? I'm hoping that everyone becomes experts after today, but we won't be testing you on it. So so you don't need to worry about that. Looks like we have a lot of folks who are age 35 to 49 joining us, but likewise a pretty good spread. And relative 60 or 70-30 spread on women versus men. And most of our attendees today are identify as white. And we have a great spread among the how do you interact with Bridge Street Neck neighborhood. Got some folks who live here. Actually, 92% of the folks who responded live here. And it looks like almost half of people patronize businesses. So I'm going to stop that sharing. We'll have one more poll later in the meeting. Thanks so much, everybody.
Okay, thanks. And then you can go to the next slide. And thanks for filling those out. And I also recognize that in some cases there might be more than one of you on the screen and you can only fill it out once. So I know it's not a perfect poll, but we wanted to get started by just a very quick, in a nutshell, overview of what is zoning. And it sounded like most of you are at least a little bit familiar with it, but maybe this will still help. So really what it is, your zoning ordinance, it's your regulatory framework that sets your rules and expectations for how you can develop your property, redevelop it, and just your general land use within the city. So your city is divided into different zoning districts. They each have a different name. And then when each district has certain uses that are allowed, different what are called dimensional standards, so that how tall a building can be, how far back a building needs to be from its neighbors or from the sidewalk, how much parking is required, and a number of other regulations. Some ordinances are pertain to the entire city, some are just for specific situations or different parts of your city. So it's can get quite complex, but that's essentially what the goal of it is. Also want to talk about what zoning can't do, because this is also something that I think sometimes people get a little confused about. For one thing, zoning cannot force landowners to redevelop their property. So if we rezone a part of your city today, that does not mean that tomorrow or ever that the owner has to redevelop their property according to that zoning. We also similarly, we can't dictate that certain uses occur. So we often hear, for example, that people want a restaurant in a certain area, and we can set up the conditions to allow a restaurant. We can make it an allowed use. It's usually a part of a menu of uses that are allowed, but we can't make somebody put a restaurant on their property. At the bottom of the screen, I think it's in the chat, I have included the website that we're using for this project. There's a lot of great information here. We have a frequently asked questions section. We have a glossary of terms, so things that can, I think, really help. We also have information about this project, past planning and related planning projects, and as well as a survey to fill out, which is largely similar to the information that you're seeing tonight. Next slide. So getting in specifically now to this project as it relates to your neighborhood, as Councilor Madore said, planning has been going on in this area for more than a decade now. So back in 2009, there was what's called a revitalization plan, which was done by a private consultant, had a number of recommendations to help shape the future of the neighborhood. A couple of years later, working with MAPC, the city started drafting zoning. It ended up not being adopted. And so then things kind of just sat on the back burner, but the neighborhood continued to grow and to evolve over the next handful of years. And I mean that both demographically as well as the physical character of the neighborhood. So a few years ago, the city started to decide to pick this back up again. And it started off as just rezoning, kind of implementing the previous zoning recommendations. But it kind of became apparent to us pretty early on that so much had changed that we needed to step back basically and take a more holistic view and really just come up with a new vision for this area. So we pivoted and we developed a vision plan, and it had a number of recommendations, and one of which is rezoning, and that's what led to this project. Next slide. So in terms of the vision plan that we recently completed with the city, I think the main takeaway that I just wanted to kind of highlight was this was very much a community-led visioning plan. This wasn't MAPC coming in and telling you our vision for the area. We engaged the neighborhood, the residents, the landowners, et cetera, as much as possible. And we had some interactive forums with a number of exercises. And emerging from that, just a couple of the highlights. One was people really were interested in this being a family-friendly neighborhood that's affordable across a range of income levels. It would be very safe for people to get around. So really thinking about the needs for walkers, bikers, and people of different ages and abilities. The neighborhood has such a unique history that people really wanted the future redevelopment to build upon this history. And then related to that should be that any development that occurs should be high quality and really be appropriate for that neighborhood context. Next slide, please. So what we're doing here, as we mentioned, is proposing to create a new zoning district. It's called an overlay district. And so why are we doing that? Next slide. First and foremost, it is to help implement the vision that I was just speaking about. So this vision plan has within it a number of recommendations. On the website, you can access this plan and feel free to skim it or read it at your leisure. The recommendations are in a number of different areas. So people were very interested in multimodal transportation, so biking and walking, for example. And a number of people were very interested in historic preservation. And so zoning touches on those aspects, but that's not the primary sort of driver. So the plan has a number of recommendations to really help with those areas as well as others. And so those are separate initiatives that the city would undertake. That being said, zoning is one of the strongest tools that a city has at its disposal to help implement the vision. And so as I go through this presentation, aspects of the zoning, I will note where they sort of tie directly into aspects of the vision and how they can help implement it. Next slide. The second reason for doing this zoning district is a bit technical and maybe a little bit dry, but we thought it was quite important. So we're going to take a minute or two to try and explain this. And it has to do with an issue that arises with what are called existing non-conforming uses. So that is something when you have a use in a district that is occurring at that time, but isn't actually allowed by the zoning. And that might happen, for example, if you had, let's say, housing that then there was a rezoning that doesn't allow housing. Well, the housing is sort of still going on. So now it's an existing non-conforming use. Next slide. And so the issue that happens, that potentially could happen with this type of situation, I had put this simple flow chart together to try to kind of explain what might happen. So let's say you take an existing non-conforming use. So I said how your city is divided into different districts. One of your districts within Bridge Street Neck is called Business Highway. You might have an existing 2-family home in this district that doesn't actually allow any type of residential. Now the landlord decides to redevelop their property. So they have 2 options. The standard option would be to redevelop it with a conforming use. So let's say they want to create an office building that's allowed under the Business Highway District. They have to then follow all the rules and regulations, so the heights, etc. But they also have a potential option to redevelop to another non-conforming use. So in this case, that might be a multifamily building. Now, if the use isn't allowed in the district, they can actually apply for a special permit, and there's no sort of established rules in this situation. And so the resulting development could be something that might be out of scale or out of character for the neighborhood. And so that's why this is a potential issue. Next slide. So what we did was we looked at where this potential overlay district is located, and we compared the existing uses to what's allowed in the existing zoning. And just one example of this, we know from the vision that people love coffee time. That's really kind of considered a major asset of the neighborhood. Coffee time is actually an example of a non-conforming use because it's zoned as residential. So that's kind of one glaring example. And actually more than half of the parcels within this district are non-conforming. So it could be subject to, again, redevelopment in a way that the neighborhood might not want. Next slide. And so by including these existing non-conforming uses as part of the menu of options for this new overlay district, this gives the city and the neighborhood the opportunity to set the rules and requirements so that we can ensure that future development is compatible with the vision. Next slide. So I'm going to hand it over to Amanda, and we can come back to this during the breakout if there are some questions about that.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm going to go over the type of zoning district and the boundaries, as well as the uses and the permitting process. As Chris mentioned, there's a whole bunch of different ways zoning can be laid out in the community. There are also different types of zoning districts, different ways to amend the zoning ordinance, I should say. So this chart is in the vision update plan. It's actually page 51 of that report. And it just goes through all the options that we looked at, and we went through to see what are the pros and the cons of each. Chris just went over that non-conforming use issue. And we want to make sure that the proposed desirable uses will be allowed, but that we do not create new non-conforming uses in the process. And at the public forum we held back in 2019, it was unanimous among the participants that people wanted the neighborhood to retain its existing uses and the character. But again, the issue is the current zoning ordinance prohibits most of the existing uses, and the zoning is just not conducive to the current character. If Bridge Street Neck were rebuilt today completely from fresh using the current zoning ordinance, it would look nothing like it does now. It would be very, very different. And so we ended up landing on an overlay district. So that way you can keep the current uses and the current standards, but have another option. Can you go to the next slide, please? So an overlay is just like it sounds. It keeps that base zoning. So that's still an option that a homeowner or a developer can use. And then the overlay goes on top of it. So it just lays on top, and it's an option that, again, a homeowner or a developer can opt into if they want to proceed in that way. So all the things that were already non-conforming, that were already conforming, continue to be conforming. And the things that are desirable that you want then become conforming, and it gives you the path forward. So with design standards, and Chris is going to talk a lot more detail about design standards later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. So this is the boundary of the overlay. You can see it extends from Webb Street all the way to the bridge, and it goes about one parcel deep on each side of Bridge Street Neck. And the reason we chose this boundary is because through the vision and process, we heard that the focus of zoning changes should be right along Bridge Street Neck, that main corridor. Next slide, please. So these are the proposed uses. So as Chris mentioned, there's a menu of options that you can choose from when you want to use your property. What we did is look at what uses are currently allowed along Bridge Street Neck. The neighborhood, if you remember that slide, just one back, it has all those different colors on it. That's 4 different zoning districts along that short stretch of Bridge Street Neck. And then within each one of the zoning districts, it allows for different uses. All of these uses are within at least one of the zoning districts. So it's just allowing the sort of continuum. What we did here is color code the uses to the map, and you'll be able to see that in another slide. And the 4 different zoning districts that are currently along Bridge Street Neck are shown in this box here. You have residential 2-family, business neighbor, and that residential 2-family only allows residential. You cannot have retail space there. You can't have industrial or offices. And then the business neighborhood allows for neighborhood serving uses. So think of a restaurant, a business office, and then the business highway and the wholesale automotive allow the industrial and retail uses. Next slide, please. So these are examples of what a unit above a first floor commercial looks like. So this is an example of mixed use development. Currently, mixed use development is only allowed in one district in Bridge Street Neck. That's the teal, the business highway, which runs, let me look at this. It goes from on the east side of Bridge Street between Webb and Beacon. So in that little stretch, you could have mixed use. Now, all 3 of these examples are on Bridge Street Neck, but only one of them is conforming and the other 2 are not. And if you wanted to build mixed use development somewhere else on Bridge Street, it wouldn't be allowed unless you're within from Beacon to Webb. Next slide, please. So this is the chart that just compares the menu of options that we are proposing with the overlay to what's existing, or what not existing, but what is allowed with the current zoning. So again, you see the zoning map in the upper right-hand corner, and the colors correspond with the table A Y means that it's permitted. An N means that the use is not permitted. And then the SP means it requires a special permit. And so that's a process that goes through the Zoning Board of Appeals. And it requires a public hearing and neighbors to be noticed, and then a decision to be made that's discretionary. So the board has to make findings for it. And again, you'll see every single one of these uses that we're proposing is allowed in at least one of the 4 districts along Bridge Street Neck, but it just carries it forward. And I will note that map on the upper right corner, it has this sort of white line going through the middle of it. That is called that's the entrance corridor overlay district. It's throughout the entire city on the major entrances into Salem. So there's already an overlay district on Bridge Street Neck. This proposed district would just be for Bridge Street, again, from Webb to the bridge, but it complements and expands upon that overlay. So this is a new district that continues to have the same requirements as the overlay, but it also has design standards. Next slide, please. So this is the zoning process, how things are permitted, or how we're proposing for things to be permitted in the overlay district. We're proposing a base plus. And what that means is what's currently required will continue to be required. Plus, there'll be additional review. So the red text highlights the base zoning process, and that remains. The baseline zoning requires a site plan review from the planning board, and that's a board of volunteers who meet at a public hearing that is noticed and published to review a project to make sure it complies with the zoning ordinance. And they review projects for construction of more than 2,000 square feet of commercial within the entrance corridor, or 6 or more residential units. What we're doing is a plus version in that any site plan review along Bridge Street Neck requires a recommendation of the planning board. Again, because this is plus, it's adding on an administrative review process for development that's less than 2,000 square feet. So regardless of whether it's commercial or residential, if it's 2,000 square feet or more, it requires review from the planning board. Where right now, you only get kicked into the planning board if it's 6 units or more. So if you think about what that would capture, if a developer was proposing 3 units at 700 square feet each, that would be 2,100 square feet. So it would kick into the planning board under the overlay, whereas under the base zoning wouldn't kick in until 6 units. And then we're also proposing this design standard waiver. And that's just because we cannot anticipate all the different circumstances or design approaches. So it's just creating some flexibility for an applicant to apply for a special permit. It is a special permit. And with that, it means that the Zoning Board of Appeals or Planning Board, the reviewing authority, would have to make findings that the project is in compliance with the vision and the design guidelines. And so it's looking at the design approach meets the underlying objectives. And there's a reason why they need to do something a little bit different, but it still meets those objectives. Next slide, please. So I'm going to hand it over to Chris to go over parking. I know that was a really lot of information. And then after parking, we're going to go into discussion. And so we'd love to hear what you think about all of this. Chris, please.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, last slide before we take a little bit of a breather. And I'd also mention that this section, this part of the presentation, I think is the most dense. So if you make it through this, then the next 2 sections will be, I think, a bit more digestible. But we want to talk quickly about parking because it does relate to uses. So generally, the amount of parking that is required relates to the type of use that's there. So with Bridge Street Neck overlay district, we have a couple aspects of parking. One has to do with the location of parking. So through the visioning process, one thing that came through quite clearly was people really want this to be a walkable neighborhood. People wanted to sort of walk next to essentially buildings and shops. They didn't really want to be walking alongside big expanses of parking lots. They wanted it located in discrete locations, such as behind the building or on the side of the building, or at least screened from the streets and adjacent properties. And so that was one aspect that was directly and explicitly written into the zoning. Now, I also just want to note that there are situations that we've heard from concerns of existing business owners where they actually want their parking front and center. And that's actually okay, because that's why we're doing an overlay district. So if they like that, then they have the option of still using the existing base zoning. So again, there's no loss of existing rights. The other aspect is how much parking is required. And for residential properties, that's based on the number of units. For other commercial properties, that's based on the amount of commercial space. And that's generally a pretty standard approach. And then beyond that, there are opportunities to take that kind of what I'd call base requirement and potentially through a special permit, reduce it slightly more. And that might be in a case of, for example, what we would call shared parking. So if you have a building that has, let's say, office on the ground floor, most of the people that need to park for that, that occurs during the day. If you have residents above, at least some of those people are probably driving during the day to work. So there's some overlap there that you can slightly reduce what would otherwise be the requirement. So that is the parking in a nutshell. Next slide. So what we're going to do now is just pause for a few minutes, depending on how many comments and questions people have. We're calling it a breakout session. Based upon our numbers, I think we will stay in this one room, right, Christian?
Yes.
And so you could maybe stop screen sharing for a moment. And again, as I think somebody had asked earlier, I would encourage people to turn on their screens if they're able to, if they feel comfortable doing that. And based upon what we just heard, we would just want to take some of your comments. If you have questions, we'll try and answer them. So the things, just as a reminder, what we've so far talked about, the boundaries of the district, the proposed uses in the district, the process, and the parking requirements as it relates to development. So if you have a comment or a question, you can either just unmute yourself and speak up. You can use the raise your hand function. Lay, I believe that name.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Chris. This is a little bit of a broader question. This is my first time on one of these meetings. What are typically the catalysts to get landowners and developers to make the changes in line with the new zoning codes? Do they typically kind of shrug it off? In your experience, does rezoning introduce more layers of development and properties around the area, or is there a bit of a time lag there?
Yeah, that's a great question. The answer is it depends. It's certainly, it occurs, once a rezoning occurs, there's still market conditions, right? So you could rezone something and we could say this whole area has to be X, Y, Z, that there's no market for, then change won't occur. So, one of the things is to ensure that the zoning that does occur, the uses allowed fit with the market. That's the first step. At that point, generally, they occur incrementally over a number of years. There might be one landowner who really is interested in rezoning or redeveloping right away, and now they have the opportunity to, and they will take that advantage of that. Even then, I mean, redevelopment's a slow process. Amanda explained the process. This doesn't happen instantaneously. It'll, like I said, it'll go incrementally. Some people might not redevelop for decades or more.
Thanks, Chris. I did get one question in the chat. I also will just note that on the project website, there is a development flowchart that provides a little bit more of a visualization about the steps a project would have to go through in order to get through the zoning overlay. And then, of course, there are other approval processes like building permits and such that have to happen. And you can find that on the website. So we've been sort of plugging it a lot, but I would really encourage everyone to check the website out. It has more information on it than any project website I think I've ever worked on. So definitely encourage you to check that one out. So we got a question from a participant named PZ, and it is, why are we continuing to have less than ample parking? People who move here move with a minimum of 1 car. How is traffic going to work in this area? Bridge Street to the MBTA, assuming that's the commuter rail station, is already gridlocked. So what is the vision for reducing or managing more traffic to that area?
Mm-hmm. So those are actually, in some ways, 2 separate issues, because if you build a lot of parking, you're actually going to have a lot more traffic. So the way, if you are highly concerned about reducing traffic, the best way, and MAPC has done a number of actually rigorous scientific statistical analyses, is that you would reducing the amount of parking that is required helps reduce the amount of traffic. Now, that being said, the other side is people want to make sure that we have enough parking, that if you live in a place and you want to be able to get to it, and that's why we have standards. So all zoning has required standards. For residential units, it's set at 1.5 spaces per unit. So it's more than 1 space per unit. So I think that hopefully helps address PZ's concern that most people, most households will have more than 1 car. But not everyone will. I think a number of households will have less than 1 car or no car at all, because you are close to the commuter rail station, and there will be some subset of people that choose to get around by walking and biking. Beyond that, I would invite, if Amanda or Lev or Christine would wish to speak up to this issue, please feel free to jump in.
And I'll just say, I know that sounds strange, 1.5 spaces per unit. Like, you're not going to have half a parking space. So we always round up. If you have 1 unit, that means you need 2 parking spaces. So we just round up to the next whole number, just to clarify.
Thank you.
We'll add that, this is Christine, for those of you who can't see me. I will add that in our community engagement process, we heard loud and clear through this project and also through my conversations with neighbors who live in the neighborhood that they would like to see the corridor to be less auto dependent as a way to reduce traffic volume and improve the safety for folks who don't drive. There are a lot of families who live in the neighborhood, and speeding and traffic speeding and volume is a concern. So one way to do that is make the corridor less auto dependent. So we were very intentional in the proposal of the zoning overlay to not include uses that drive traffic to the neighborhood. Those uses that already exist that are more auto oriented, they can continue to exist, and the base zoning will allow them to exist. But we don't want to encourage more auto oriented uses, because we heard from neighbors that they would like to see less of a traffic impact generated by auto-oriented uses. So we definitely took that feedback to inform this zoning overlay process.
Thank you, Councilor Madore.
Awesome. So we did get another question, and that is, are your parking calculations including driveway parking?
So the parking requirements are referred to as on-site parking. So they have to be on the property. Parking in front of the house, on the street, does not count towards the minimum parking requirement. So it's in the driveway, on the lot. That's the required parking. Does that answer the question?
I see. Yes, I see thumbs up. I think it does. All right, so I just got a couple of other questions. So I'll start with the one that I got first, and that is from Lay. Can we touch on trees, greenery, and shade? Walking down Bridge Street is a nightmare in the glaring sun. I usually walk down to the Cove. How does this zoning impact that?
Sure. This doesn't directly affect that. I would say we part of the vision that did come in that people were concerned about, that's what I would call the public realm, right? That's your streets. And that's really, in many ways, up to the city to take that on. And that was part of the vision. And as I said earlier, you know, zoning doesn't solve every issue as it relates to kind of achieving the vision for the neighborhood. It's one of the levers. And I think, you know, the city has a number of initiatives and really, frankly, work to do to fully realize the vision. I think that falls under that description.
So I'm going to speak to that really quickly because the city did get a large infusion of funds to plant trees in our more dense neighborhoods. And part of that includes the Bridge Street Neck neighborhood, kind of the lower Bridge Street area. So if you have a moment, you can go and Google greening the gateway cities, and you can find out if you live on an address where you qualify for a free tree. And I'm not joking, you can request a free tree to be planted on your property. And then there will be representatives from the state to come to look at your property and see which tree would best fit the conditions of your property, and they will plant it for you for free, but you're responsible for keeping it alive for at least the first couple of years by watering and taking care of it. So there's also, on top of that, there's also, we do have a tree planting budget, and I will make sure to reiterate that the Bridge Street Neck corridor is a heat island. I've walked up and down the corridor many times. I know how hot it can get. And this is something that I've heard repeatedly. So I continue to advocate for more tree plantings along the corridor.
And I also want to note that through the site plan review process that most of this development would go through, it requires a planning board review. And our current zoning ordinance for site plan review has the planning board evaluate the adequacy of landscaping to make sure that that makes sense for the property. And our planning board does a really great job at, you know, negotiating with developers to get more trees on the property. And this is all done through a public process and public hearings. And so if you see a project that's proposed, we'd also encourage you to go to, you know, meetings, but the planning board will work with them to get, you know, shade trees right along the property line. And so that helps with it too.
Awesome. So I think we're running a little bit behind, and I've gotten a couple of questions. So I'm going to try and combine two of them that I think are really related. And these are both from Alice. The first question is, what are some examples of auto-oriented uses that increase the number of cars? And then a second question, I'm sorry, not from Alice, but from Alec, is wondering whether there's parallel plans to increase public transit, not just to the train station, but also sort of within the city more generally.
Okay. Well, one example of an auto-oriented use that we specifically decided not to include as part of the overlay district is drive-throughs. So that causes a lot of traffic. It also causes safety issues for pedestrians because you often need multiple curb cuts. So existing drive-throughs, again, can still operate if that's an option under the base zoning. That's still there as an option, but it wasn't included as part of the overlay district. In terms of overall transit, you know, that's a little bit out of the scope of this, but I'll leave it to the city if they want to kind of briefly address that.
Yeah, so the city, we've been doing a lot of work on micro mobility. So that's getting that first last mile connection with the Salem Skipper. We have a bike share program, launching a car share program. So just opportunities to allow for a car light or a car free lifestyle. It just gives those opportunities.
Great. There's one additional or two additional questions, and then I think I'm gonna move us on because we're running a little bit behind already. But one question is from Pamela, and that is, what is the vision then for the zone? Is it just residential? If I'm not fully understanding the vision, if it is to avoid an increase to traffic, since it seems like mixed-use restaurants and shops will entice cars, since many people can't walk from downtown to the end of the street, or won't.
Okay, so the vision, again, I would encourage people to go onto the website to kind of really read the vision. There's a vision statement, which is essentially a half a page paragraph. And then we have other elements that are visual preference to help kind of visualize it, as well as people actually created little site plans as part of the process for what they would like to see. Essentially, in a nutshell, what people wanted to see was that the majority of the neighborhood would remain the way it is, which is primarily residential. Along Bridge Street itself, people saw it mainly being, again, the way it is, but with pockets of mixed use development, and then commercial, and then a mix of commercial and residential uses.
Awesome.
And I'll keep, as we kind of keep going on this presentation, we're going to show some more visuals. This will hopefully help communicate the vision, again, as we go along. So I think on that note, why don't we if you could reshare your screen, Christian.
Great.
We will keep moving forward. So as it relates to the physical character of the neighborhood, and specifically along Bridge Street itself. So again, that's what we're talking about. One of the things we did was called a visual preference survey, where community participants, picked the types of pictures that relate to the types of, well, buildings, open space, public realm. I'm just showing buildings here that people thought sort of fit within the neighborhood or would like to see in the neighborhood. And as you can see from these pictures, there's no one sort of architectural style. Everything's fairly different. There are some flat roofs, some pitched roofs, but there are also some commonalities. Generally, what people want was 3-story buildings. That there were some groups that actually thought maybe even 4 stories would be okay, but the consensus was generally 3-story buildings, and with a variety, again, of roof types and other sort of architectural features. So if you go to the next slide. So here we're showing what I call the lot standards. So there's lot standards, there's building standards, and then what the Bridge Street Neck has, which is becoming more common, but I wouldn't say is not generally found in district ordinances, are design standards. So we're going to start kind of at the most basic level, and that's the lot itself. So a couple things to hit. We have the minimum lot size. That's 5,000 square feet. So where did we get that number? That's actually much smaller than what the minimum is under the base zoning for most of the districts. But the reason we chose 5,000 square feet is because that's actually what you have there today. So those are those small lots. It's actually one of the things that I think makes Bridge Street great, is having these kind of small lots that allows for these smaller developments, smaller buildings, more unique buildings. Another thing I would note is the primary street setback. So primary street, that refers to Bridge Street, and it's between 0 and 10 feet. So 0 feet means that it's right up against the sidewalk. We have that throughout the corridor in a lot of buildings. And so that's where you're walking along the sidewalk and you have kind of the windows of whatever it's a restaurant or business sort of right next to you. But we also wanted to give some flexibility. And so we have it being that a building can be set back as much as 10 feet. And within that, we also put requirements for what is allowed within that 10-foot front setback or front yard. And what's allowed is things like cafe seating. And that was another thing that through the vision people really wanted. What is not allowed is parking. So that's something that's specifically not allowed. And I believe there's some flexibility that if you wish to have a greater setback, again, you can apply for a special permit to do that if you have some sort of compelling reason. In terms of amount of open space, again, something that's generally standard is you require some percentage of the lot to be open space when there's residential. And 15% for this type of environment is usually a pretty good amount. And then we have standards for what does that mean? What is open space? What counts towards open space? So if you have a common roof deck, that can count towards your open space requirement. If you have a private balcony, for example, that does not. So you can go to the next slide. I think that hits those highlights. Another thing that we want to talk about was, again, I noted that people were interested in 3-story buildings and with a variety of roof types. And so we had to go kind of now to the next level of detail and think, well, if we're allowing 3 stories, what's the actual height that's allowed? And so we are proposing 2 different heights. So 35 feet, as you can see in this diagram, for a flat roof building. That's basically what would allow you to get 3 stories. If you want to have a pitched roof, 35 feet usually isn't going to be quite enough because it just takes up a lot of room. So if you go to the next slide, so for a pitched roof building, we're allowing just a slight increase of that up to 38 feet. And that's what's going to allow that pitched roof to actually occur and be in sort of a nice proportion. So one of the questions that has come up, and we kind of are looking to get some input on this, so I think we're going to have a poll in a second, is there's different ways that we can allow the flat roofs to occur. And the question really relates to, if you go to the next slide, is should that be done by right, or should you have to get a special permit in order to allow a flat roof? Christian, if you want to kind of walk through the actual question.
Yes, so the question is how should, and you'll get a poll in just a second, much in the same way that you did the first time. But the question is, how should flat roof buildings be allowed? And the first option is by right. And so as Chris explained, that's not discretionary. It would be allowed as long as it does not exceed the maximum allowed height discussed on the previous slide. Or do you want it to be allowed by special permit, which is discretionary and means that the planning board would need to make findings that the building meets the design objectives of the district, like Amanda described earlier. And then the third option is that you don't have a preference. So I'm going to launch this poll.
And I do want to clarify that what we're proposing is for a flat roof to be at 35 feet and a pitched roof at 38 feet. So you can't have a flat roof building at the 38.
All right, so I'm seeing responses come in. A few more folks who still haven't voted, so I'll leave the poll open for a little bit longer. All right. So there's a couple folks who haven't voted. I'm going to give us maybe, just saw one poll come in. I'll give us until 1 minute. So 5 more seconds. All right, so I'm going to end the poll, and it looks like the most preferred way was by special permit. There were 47% of respondents, or 8 people, participants said special permit. 7 people said by right, so it's very close, and 2 people said no preference.
Thanks, Christian. So similar to last week's forum, there's no strong consensus on this question. Thank you. So you can go to the next slide then. So another part I want to talk about, I think this might be one of the most challenging aspects of planning, even among planners, and that's this issue of how do we visualize density? So when we talk about residential density, we usually talk about the number of units per acre. The reason it's really tricky, though, is most parcels are not an acre. And in fact, on Bridge Street, as I noted, most parcels are much less than 1 acre. So an acre is over 40,000 square feet. As I noted, most of the parcels are around 5,000 square feet. So one of the things we did was we looked at the existing properties along Bridge Street that have residential, and we want to see what is their units per acre. And you can see more than 80% of the existing properties are actually higher than 16 units per acre. You can see down towards the south end of the quarter, you have a few units that are above 40 units per acre. Again, that doesn't mean 40 units because the parcels are very small, but it just shows that this, relatively speaking, is a fairly dense area. So what we thought we would do was show a handful of pictures to help you see what does this sort of 16, 17 acres, what does that actually look like? Next slide. So this is one example along Bridge Street. There are 3 units in this building. This building itself is about 17 units. This property, I should say, is about 17 units per acre. Next slide. Here's another one zoning 2 units, over 17 units per acre, another example. Next slide. Here we have again 2 units, just approaching 17 units per acre. Next slide. This one's 3 units, just shy of 16 units per acre. Next slide. And here's another one, again, 3 units, approaching 16 units per acre. Next slide. I think we have 2 more. So here's one that's a little bit above 17 units per acre. There's just 2 units in this building. And then finally, this one, it's just a single unit, but it's basically at approaching 19 units per acre. And so really, I think what the takeaway for me here is, when we say 16 units per acre, in this context, we're not talking about apartment buildings or large apartment buildings or blocks of them. We're really talking about these sort of smaller 2 to 3 unit buildings. So if you go to the next slide, another piece of analysis we then did was, we said, well, let's say that the zoning was 16 units per acre. How many units would you actually get? And if you look at the yellow and the orange, most of those units, you would only be getting 2 to 3 units. So the vast majority of properties in the district, you can only get 2 to 3 units per property. There's one outlier, that kind of dark red one, that is the Clipper Ship Inn property. And that's actually large enough that it might even be used a completely separate type of zoning if they ever want to redevelop. That's called a planned unit development. So hope that does kind of help with the density, but we're pretty soon going to go back into our discussion session. And if there are questions about this, we can try to answer it, and hopefully we'll get some feedback for, does this feel like the appropriate density to you? Next slide. Just one other aspect that I want to talk about now briefly is this issue that has come up that, again, I'm starting to see more in zoning ordinances, and it's called the amount of glazing that is required. And that's essentially the amount of windows that are required, how much windows. It's something that, again, in the vision, people really wanted this. People didn't want to be walking along major, huge blank walls. And so we've included a requirement for the amount of glazing. And then later on, in another part of the ordinance, we describe, well, how do you actually measure that? What are the various sort of requirements to actually achieve the effect that we want? So next slide. So all of those elements that I just described, as well as some other ones, all of that basically translates into this table, which would be included in the ordinance. And so again, you can see what are the appropriate building heights, 3 stories, 38 feet for a pitched roof building. Things like how much glazing is required, 60% on the ground floor for commercial buildings. It's, again, a fairly standard. We are right now tentatively proposing 16 units per acre. We actually think that's kind of on the conservative side. You saw a number of buildings that were 17 units per acre that, I think personally, were extremely attractive. And so we just want to get some feedback to see, does 16 feel right? Do you think we should go a little bit higher? Another element on the bottom there is called vertical facade modulation. This is another thing that goes beyond, I think, what some standard ordinances have. And this is to help sort of achieve kind of an effect that avoids blank walls and monotony. And this then will tie into the design standards for kind of what are the actual requirements as it relates to this number of 40 feet. So with that, I think we can go to the next slide, Christian, and probably, again, stop sharing for a moment. So based on what I just discussed, again, elements related to the lot standards, elements related to the building standards, the density, we just want to pause again and get some of your feedback and your comments about what you think about this. Go ahead.
I was wondering if we had any provisions or had given any thought to awnings and things of that sort to give more horizontal interest to the street instead of it being just a flat corridor.
Absolutely, and that's actually the next section is going to be the design side of it. So again, that's an important piece that we saw a lot of interest from the community in having this type of design elements related. So I'll get to that shortly. Gail.
Yeah, so I was wondering, when you were talking about the building heights, I was thinking about adjacent properties with solar panels, and I was just wondering if, there was any regard in this planning process to, that, or is solar panels even considered part of this process?
So for solar panels, we're actually looking at a separate ordinance that would look at green building requirements, including things like solar. So that's not part of this. It's going to be part of a much larger city project. So stay tuned for that.
I'm just going to add a side note over there because I know that Councilor Riccardi is on the call as well. There is a green building ordinance that is before the city council right now, but it's still in committee. So we are taking steps in recognizing the need to provide or even require more renewable energy resources on our buildings.
Thank you. Just going back to the density, do people feel like 16 units per acre based on what we showed is appropriate? Maybe just even by, you can speak up or just a shake of nod of the head.
I'm generally pro density. I'm from New York City, so it's one of the most dense places on the planet. Not that that's, fitting for Salem, but I was wondering if we do increase the density, are we hoping to encourage and increase the services to the neighborhood as well? Because it's really frustrating not to have a source of food or groceries in this area. I have to get in my car. Walking back from the train, I can't stop anywhere. Well, now maybe recently, but can't stop anywhere to grab a drink or I just have to kind of just beeline back home.
Thank you. Sorry, Alec.
Alec, yeah, I'm seeing that there seems to be kind of an inconsistency in the vision that seems to valorize the economic diversity of the corridor, and it really has a kind of a wonderful mix that you could never really almost plan. And at the same time, having this low density that of 16 units per acre, I think really would limit access for people to this. And so if Salem wants to really provide the kind of housing we need in the region, this having a little bit more density here in a place that from all that you've shown can clearly sustain it, that seems to be, it would add to the vibrancy and diversity of the area.
Thank you very much for those comments.
I think sort of embedded in that, Alec actually sent me a question in the chat, and part of that was, are there provisions for low-income housing as part of this zoning?
Yeah. So the city does not have a requirement for affordable housing. They do have a policy that is generally essentially recommended. But, and I mean, I'm going to let you kind of clarify anything I say incorrectly, but regardless of that policy, generally that would kick in when you have a certain number of units. The economics just tend not to work when you're only doing 3 or even 4 unit buildings. It just doesn't work to have any affordable units. The vast majority of buildings on this in this corridor, because of how small the lots are, would only be, even if you moved up the density, you still would probably be below that threshold.
Yeah, and a lot of the affordable units that are along Bridge Street Neck are naturally occurring affordable in that they're not subsidized or deed restricted. They just tend to have lower rents. And so, part of the thought process too is if you have a process that's easier for a homeowner to use and doesn't require these non-conforming uses, and that makes it easier to create those units and have naturally occurring affordable units.
I hate to keep on harping on this, but you've got portions towards the Webb Street area that, if I'm correct, you were saying they have as many as 40 units per acre, and they still look great. I don't, and so I'm not really understanding at all the 16 limit. It seems to be kind of choking the capacity of this corridor, which especially if you begin to do the kind of mixed use scenarios that you guys laid out of having some sort of retail or other activities on the ground level, and then adding units above that could be residential. It seems that one could go way over 16 and still keep with the character of the street.
I would tend to agree with Alec.
And I say that a big benefit to that too is if you increase that, you'd allow more units, and then the mechanics would work financially to require an affordable unit. So right now we require affordable units at, once you get to the 6 unit mark. Now, if you can get more properties up there, then the market just works better, the financial feasibility of it.
And what that means is that people that are working at some of these places can afford to live here too, which is, you know, or policemen or firemen or shopkeepers or retail people at mechanics, they wouldn't be forced to live in some other area.
Thank you very much for those comments. I see Alice with her hand raised.
Thank you. I had a question too. Having a parking requirement of 1 spot per living unit instead of 1.5, does that help keep units affordable?
That would go away because parking is a significant cost to the construction of housing. So again, lowering the amount of parking would help make places more affordable. I think you're right.
Thanks.
Okay, do we have any other comments, Christian, or should we go on? We have one more section, and then we'll come back again to take final kind of questions and comments in the next 20 minutes. We're trying to wrap up by 7:30 just to, we know this is a lot to take in, so, and not maybe the most riveting thing, but we appreciate you all attending tonight.
I'm muted, sorry about that. I don't see any comments coming in the chat. There was one actually that I thought maybe we would be addressing, but we haven't. So it was from the previous conversation, that is, are there incentives for non-conforming properties to conform, but with the exception of coffee time, since everybody loves coffee time?
I mean, there's no explicit incentives. I think there's sort of a market reality that depending on what that use is, whether it would conform or not, depending on the use, it might conform if it's something that people love. Like, so coffee time would be a conforming use under the overlay district, because we are allowing that type of use as part of the overlay district. I think that maybe was what Amanda was going to say, because I saw you take yourself off mute and then put yourself back on. Okay, so let's do, we have one more section. And so this is, again, as we were saying, there's one additional part to this ordinance that I'm seeing more common, especially in sort of these places that people want to be sort of these walkable mixed use districts. And that has to do with the two sort of related things called design guidelines and design standards. And sorry, I have my 7-year-old son kind of calling up to me right now, so I'm getting a little distracted because I'm alone with him in the house. So the difference is guidelines are advisory and they are sort of subjective types of things. Often these are separate from the zoning ordinance itself. They're sort of separate guidelines. Standards, they are obligatory, they're measurable, and so you either, it's kind of black and white, you either meet the standard or you do not. In this case, we are proposing to include both aspects within the zoning ordinance. So we start with the zoning, the guidelines, the design guidelines. Next slide, sorry, Christian. So the design guidelines really set the stage. So these are aspects that were taken directly from the vision plan. So again, you can read that in more detail. And what it does is it helps communicate to a landowner or would-be developer what the expectations for the community are. So there are things like, and so the way it's set up is we highlight a bunch of areas and then we provide some explanatory text. So building orientation. So that's having the building facing towards Bridge Street. What is the appropriate setback of the building? How do we reduce the visual impact of parking, and why is that important? Sensitive building height. So in some cases you might have more historic buildings, and so how can you be sort of sensitive to that adjacent property? The importance of having interesting roof lines. How building mass relates to sort of the effect of walking and what it feels like to you as a neighborhood. Next slide. A couple other aspects we have are, how is the front facade organized? What are, what's the importance of ground floor windows? Some of these architectural details that help, again, provide visual interest. Zoning can't dictate the types of materials that are used, but we can say what we like. We can say what is recommended. We can say the types of materials that are discouraged for the neighborhood. And finally, just going to Leah's earlier question, the importance of canopies and awnings. So again, these are part of the guidelines. There might be situations where it's not appropriate to have these in every case, but again, they're advisory and it helps communicate that. Next slide. So then the other aspect are the standards. So these are the things that you have to do unless you get a waiver through a special permit through that process that Amanda spoke about earlier. So I'll run through a few of these. One of them has to do with the way that the sort of overall massing of a building is composed. And so we describe having sort of a primary mass with an optional secondary mass. The purpose of this, again, going back to the vision, is it helps keep the character of the neighborhood. Most of the buildings along Bridge Street are sort of these fairly simple massings. And so again, unless there's some really compelling reason for a developer to do something different, they should generally abide by that. Next slide. And then roofs. So we described the types of roofs that are allowed in the neighborhood. Again, we still have this open question about whether a flat roof is allowed by a special permit or whether it'll be by right, along with these other types of roofs that are things that we see today along the corridor. Again, this doesn't mean that you couldn't do something different. If there's some reason you wanted to do a shed roof or something, you can, but you have to sort of, the onus is on you to essentially show the planning board and the design review committee why this would be an asset for the neighborhood. I mentioned earlier about this requirement of articulating the buildings at every 40 feet. So the building standards provided that requirement of 40 feet. The guidelines explain why this is important. The standards now explain how you can do this. And it's through various changes in the vertical plane of the building, various architectural details or window patterns, etc. Next slide. And then we go one level of more detail. And again, this is because the community through the visioning were very concerned about the design of buildings. People didn't want to dictate a single architectural style by any means, but people really wanted to ensure that there was high quality design. And so we have this additional piece that we're calling building components. So these are essentially massing architectural elements that are integrated into the building itself. And the intent of this section is to be clear, as well as flexible for new buildings and modified buildings, and to be consistent with the character and the vision. And so this would apply for the facade along Bridge Street. And again, there's that opportunity to have additional components. Again, the onus is on the developer to prove that it'll help the neighborhood. Next slide. So I won't go through these in detail, but I just wanted to give sort of at the top, this is the list of components. Again, these things are all found within Bridge Street today. The bottom half show two examples then of how these components that have standards that are applied to them. And so the standards have things like maximum widths and how much they can project out of the building, how tall they could be if applicable, how much windows they need to be, again, if applicable, any other standards that are relevant. And so we have these standards for each of these components. Next slide. And so, as I mentioned, all of these components are things that are found in the neighborhood today. And so here's just a few examples of these components. So you see a bay window. Of course, dormers are found throughout this the neighborhood in the city. Some example of a porch, cross gable on the bottom left, and an example of a shed dormer on the bottom right. Next slide. Porticos, stoops, and then finally a side wing. So again, these are the list of all of these components. And these are just some examples. We have other ones as well that we could also show if people are interested. Next slide. And then the final piece, again, that is fairly standard, I would say, to include, has to do with screening. And again, this is the purpose of these is for these sort of necessary functions that maybe are not always sort of desirable, but are needed. Things like loading facilities, service areas, mechanical equipment. The point is to ensure that they really don't sort of detract from the neighborhood character. And so these things, they need to be screened or fully enclosed. If there's roof mounted mechanical equipment, they need to be set back. If there's mechanical equipment that emits noises, that there would need to be just a study to ensure that the effects of them are not too loud on the adjacent properties. So with that, next slide. Okay, so I think you can actually stop the screen. So as you can see, we went from longest to shortest, which was by design. So I guess for this last section now, based upon what you just saw as it relates to these design elements, any comments that people have? Maybe I'll start with a real basic question. Do people like the approach of including these sort of various design pieces within there? I do see some head nods. Okay.
I've gotten a couple of folks in the chat saying that they like the design guidelines, especially that they feel thoughtful and aligned with the area. I did get one question, and that is, how will these zoning standards protect the historical integrity of the buildings?
Okay. So again, within the vision plan, if you go to that, we have, I should have mentioned also, we have a large working group of a number of stakeholders within the neighborhood. These are both property owners, business owners, and we have members of various historical preservation committees. And so that this was very much on people's mind. And so there are separate tools for historic buildings to help sort of preserve them. And again, those we've outlined and included those within the vision plan. It's not directly tied, I would say, to zoning itself. Amanda, do you have any additional comments on that, or did I basically capture that?
Yeah, you capture that. So zoning does not offer the protection, this zoning ordinance, but we do have a newly adopted demolition delay ordinance that has its own protections. And again, in the vision plan, it outlines some other things that the city could consider or the community could consider for, protections, but yep, it's not part of this zoning ordinance.
I just wanted to make an observation that when you were showing the articulation on the buildings in the first couple of slides there with the awnings, everything else like that, if I'm correct, the density of those units there would be up in the 40 range. That seemed to be a pretty dense zone that you showed as an example. And one of the beauty of the design articulation, sort of breaking up the elements, is that it doesn't make it feel so big. And so I think that there may be ways of balancing these, I think, are really great design standards that you're all sharing with also providing the kind of diversity of income and stuff that people are looking for. So they could help that by making people not feel like they're overwhelmed by big block-like structures.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great point, that the design standards, regardless of the density, would I think help ensure that buildings don't feel like these big blocks that maybe some people have in their head when they hear high density buildings. So I totally agree. That's a good point.
I did get one.
We don't want the seaport here. No, we don't want the seaport here. Another repeat of the seaport. It's not going to happen.
Absolutely. Thank you. Christian, you said there was another comment or
Yeah,
question?
I just got a couple of questions actually. So the first one is, this is from Pamela, and she asked, these look fairly upscale and expensive to build. Are they looking at more luxury units, which are starting at 500K for a 1-bedroom, or any guideline? Are we including any guidelines on making things more affordable / inviting, which I think we discussed a little bit earlier, but also any thoughts on incentives to being carless for residences in the neighborhood?
Yeah. Well, the diagrams I put together are just that. They're just diagrams. They're not intended to convey luxury homes by any means. They're just, by nature, a newer building is going to look newer than an older existing building. In terms of the aspect of incentivizing to be carless, I think the city does a really great job of providing multimodal options. There were a lot of recommendations about how people can improve, how the city could improve the bikeability, especially of the area. And I think really, in my mind, it's providing those options for the people who want to be carless to actually be able to feel comfortable doing that is one of the best ways. Again, it does go hand in hand with, if you provide parking, that's going to be more costly homes, and B, you're incentivizing people who want to drive to live in those homes. I live in Charlestown. This is an issue that I'm constantly dealing with our new development. I very much, appreciate the comment that, we don't want to have too much parking. We do need sufficient parking because there will be some people who do want or need to drive. But if you provide too much of it, then it will raise the costs.
I got another question from Susan, and that is, I think landscaping offers an additional opportunity to recommend small positive changes. Is it possible to encourage the use of native plants?
The answer is yes, absolutely. And I believe we have that included in the design guidelines. And if not, we will add that because that's a great point. So yes. Amanda, did you want to also say something maybe back on the previous question?
I just love to talk about affordable housing. So I also wanted to note that, again, an affordable unit, a deed restricted affordable unit, it costs just as much to build as a market rate unit. And building is really expensive. And so that's where we talk about the finances, where a developer really needs to get to at least 6 units to be able to internally finance that affordable unit to make enough money to build that affordable unit, because they're not getting a subsidy. They're building that in, using the finances within their own project. And they're not going to get a loan from the bank to build the project if it doesn't finance right. And so you need that higher density to get those deed restricted affordable units. It's just not feasible to require at the lower range at 2 to 3 units.
I do not have any other questions.
Right.
Gail sent in a comment that just says, I also appreciate the requirement for the acoustic study for mechanical equipment.
Okay, good. That was actually an open question, so it's good to get some positive feedback on that. Well then, why don't you turn back on the slides? We just have I think a next step slide essentially. So sort of where do we go from here now? Thank you again for everybody for attending tonight and for providing your input and for asking your questions. There's additional opportunities for input. Again, as Christian has noted, this website, that there's opportunities to provide your input on that. We also have something that we're calling office hours available. Christian, do you want to tell people how they can access that?
Yes. So the way that you would access office hours, I'm actually going to pull up the project website so I can show you that way. So on the project website, you'll see these tabs right here. And if you scroll over, there's a tab that says office hours. So in order to schedule an office hours appointment with either the city or MAPC, you scroll down to this tool, which is through a program called Calendly, and you can select on the tool what date to pick. So I'm going to pick the 31st. And then we have our available times listed out in 15-minute increments. And once you select that time, you add your name and your email, and it puts a calendar reservation with a Zoom appointment on my calendar, and then I forward that to Chris or Amanda. This is a really great opportunity to get some more information specific to some of the questions that you have. I also would encourage you to share the website widely with other people so that they know about all the content that's on it. I just also want to point out that the vision update is included in this page of the documents. I know we've been referencing it a lot, but you can access it on this website as well.
Thank you. And so we're taking everything we hear from everyone, and we'll be sort of synthesizing that over the next month or so. And then as we get into the fall, there will be, to adopt any zoning, it requires a public hearing. And so that will be another opportunity where we'll present this and for people to weigh in and hopefully support it before it goes to a final vote. So you can see here another just additional way to get in touch with us, our direct emails and phones. So with that, just wanted to again thank everyone for tonight, for attending and for being engaged with us, and we will be in touch soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Everyone.
This meeting
you.
will be added to the public input website as well. And we have the recording from the last forum, which was the same presentation. But if you know of people who could not attend and you think they'd be interested, you can let them know they can watch it there. We also have SATV here and they will be broadcasting. So thank you, SATV.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much. This is really great.